And joining us now to talk about Canada's place at the table, the 21st Prime Minister of Canada, Paul Martin. It's good to see you again, sir.
Well, it's good to be back again.
Thanks for coming here. We learned, of course, recently at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh that the countries that represent 85% of the world's economies are going to take it upon themselves to solve this international financial crisis and the recession. And my first question to you is, how effective so far do you think the G20 has been in tackling those two things?
Oh, I think very effective. And there have been 3 meetings in the space of less than a year, and I think that they really have dealt with it. And I think we're seeing it in the degree of coordination. Now, look, have they solved the problem? Absolutely not. Could any grouping in such short an instance have solved it? No. But I also think that not only have they come up with all these stimulus packages, some coordination, but I think they're also dealing on prevention, because, of course, the fact is that we have to stop the next financial crisis, not just solve this one.
Oh, can you tell us when the next one's going to happen? That'd be good to know.
No, I can't, but I can certainly tell you that it's inevitable. Unfortunately, we have them. We've had them 5 or 6 in my time, as an example, and the worst ones are inevitably those that have a banking problem at their core.
Can you imagine these 20 large economies acting in the interest of the world rather than in their own?
Well, that's really the whole gamble, and I think that's what has to be said. The G20 was a Canadian initiative, and I'm very glad to see how far it has progressed. I now think it's really incumbent upon Canada to say, look, we've created a steering committee, but it can't simply be a club of the self-interested. What it has to be is a club representing not only those countries, but really the 173 who aren't at the table.
I'll say it because you won't. It came out of something you started, right? You started the L20, and it emerged from that.
Well, it was a Canadian initiative really all the way along, and I think that Canadian officials, Canadian think tanks played a huge role in building up the intellectual firepower. So I think that, yeah, I think Canadians can feel pretty good about it.
Do you think the G20 is prepared to create some kind of international regulatory body with teeth that can prevent the kind of reckless risk-taking that took place that got us into this mess?
Well, that's the debate that's going to take place between now and the Canada-Korean meeting, G20 meeting, which will be taking place in June. That is, in fact, the issue. They've said that they want to have a coordinating body, that they want to basically have some kind of a minimum level of bank regulation. But the real thing is that given the fact that the crisis started because London and New York were competing each other, given the fact that Hong Kong and Shanghai are going to come in, that Frankfurt and Paris are going to come in and try to basically compete with London and New York, you can't do that on a voluntary basis. You have to have a mandatory body, and you have to have sanctions.
So can you imagine a group of countries coming to, let's pick anybody, the Germans, the French, and saying, your banks are under, they're not adequately capitalized here, and we're either going to sanction you, you've got to bring them up, or there's going to be penalties to pay.
Well,
how do you do that?
I think that basically you lay that out, and then you have the debate. And if you were to say to me instinctively, will the Germans want to do it? Will the Americans want to do it? The answer is no. But the question they really have to ask themselves, if they don't do that now, then how are they going to make sure that they're not going to get caught in a Chinese meltdown of a hedge fund? Or how are they going to handle, for instance, a huge meltdown of the Indian housing market? Those are the kinds of things that they're going to have to deal with going ahead, and the time to prevent those problems is now, and they're only going to do it if, in fact, there are sanctions.
Well, let me follow up on what you said a moment ago. If one of the reasons we got into this mess was that London and New York were both trying to vie for the financial capital of the world, and as you point out, there are, Hong Kong's coming on, Shanghai's coming on, it seems like the pressure to take additional reckless risk in the future in order to reclaim or attempt to become number one is all there. So how do we avoid all that going forward?
Well, because we have to have a set of rules. They have to be agreed to. And then there is going to have to be not a global regulator. I really believe that regulation has to be national. But there's going to have to be a coordinator. And that coordinator is going to have to be very well staffed. You're going to have peer review of everybody's regulations. And then at the end, you're going to have the iron fist for precisely the reason that you gave. Now, we do have an iron fist in terms of our trade negotiations. The WTO does exist. You can bring a country in front of the WTO. We're going to have something along those lines in terms of bank regulations. Because I'll go back to it. The single biggest problem in any financial crisis is when banks go down, because that's when there's a loss of confidence. So we can't afford to have that happen, and the only way you're going to stop it, I can tell you, is if there are sanctions.
All of what you're talking about today points to the requirement for a new definition of sovereignty, because everybody's got to, put a little water in their wine, or else this doesn't work. Sovereignty, I gather today, is don't tell us what to do. We are running things in our own borders, and thank you very much. We don't need your advice. How useful is that concept today?
Well, it's really outdated. The fact is that concept was established in 1648 at the Treaty of Westphalia. There's a lot of water that has gone under the tunnel, under the bridge since then. That said, sovereignty means rights, the rights of the countries. Today, sovereignty has to include duties as well. And unless you're prepared to do that, the G20 isn't going to be able to function. And in fact, the globalization isn't going to really be able to benefit people. Now, you're beginning to see that debate changing. For instance, the responsibility to protect, which says a country cannot oppress its own population, that is really a variation on the traditional definition of sovereignty. Very interesting, the former U.S. Homeland Security Secretary, Michael Chertoff, essentially started off by defending that traditional definition, but suddenly realized if the Americans are going to contain terrorism, they're going to be able to have to impose duties on countries to contain terrorism. My view, you're going to have to impose duties on countries not to mess up everybody else's economy because they have really very poor bank regulation.
Do you see an appetite out there to change the definition of sovereignty as we have traditionally come to know it?
It's a lot more there today than it was, let's say, before this financial crisis. I think the financial crisis is going to change a lot of people's minds. And the best example I can give you this. We're arguing sovereignty. Do you not think that Canada's sovereignty was violated by the fact that American and European banks were imprudently regulated and actually brought the global recession down? I think that that's going to have a huge effect if you say to the Americans or to the Europeans, well, that's fine, but are you prepared to run the same risk that the Chinese or the Indian economies in 10 years will do the same thing to you?
How do you tell the Americans what to do?
I think what you have to do is say what's in their own best interest. And if you can demonstrate that, in fact, global regulation, or at least the coordination of global regulation, is in their own best interests, then I think they'll do it. And the best example I can give you is it was really Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, who has come along and said, look, we're going to have minimum standards, and they're going to have to be pretty high for banks. Well, then I think the question is, to Tim Geithner, the Germans don't agree with you. So if you come to an agreement, are you prepared to say that countries that violate that agreement are going to have to face some kind of peer review and maybe some kind of sanction if they don't? And if Geithner is serious about what he's saying, he's going to have to say, yes, I do.
Sanction meaning?
Well, sanction meaning that if your banks aren't going to have this level of standards, then we're not going to allow your banks to come into our countries. I don't think there's anything else except that.
Are there countries today that you would point to in the world and say, yes, they get it. They understand this new definition of sovereignty has to include duties and not just rights?
Well, I'm not sure that the American Congress gets it, but I actually think the American administration does, because that's what Geithner has put forth.
With the rise of the BRIC countries, Canada's economy is arguably less significant in the world today. Is one of the reasons that you are such an ardent supporter of the G20 is because you see the writing on the wall for this country? We may not be as big a player going forward as we have been in the past, and this is the way that we are going to maintain our role as a player?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that. The fact is that the Americans or the Chinese, as an example, are going to be listened to because of the Americans or the Chinese, and they got these huge mega markets. Europe could do it if it gets its act together. We're 33 million people. There has to be a forum where we can punch above our weight, and that forum has to be something like the G20. The G8, really, without China at the table, was simply more and more irrelevant. We could punch above our weight all we wanted to, but we weren't going to make it felt without the Chinese and the Indians at the same table. Oh, there's no doubt about it. The G20 is a way in which Canada can do that.
Do we still belong in the G8?
Oh, sure.
Really? We're not one of the biggest state economies in the world, though.
No, well, I think the real question is, what's the future of the G8? I think the G7, finance ministers, I think that's got an ongoing role because those countries want to come together. I think that the G8, with the coming into being of the G20, is going to find itself really slipping very much on the world scale.
Let me turn our conversation to the legitimacy of the G20. And I think probably most people would say, what do we want these 20 major economies of the world to do? Well, be leaders when it comes to reducing poverty in the world would be a good start. And I went to a speech of yours at CG in Waterloo week and a half ago or so. You pointed out 24 of the 28 poorest countries in the world are in Africa. One member of the G20 is an African country, South Africa. Should the Africans be rightfully skeptical that this international body, just doesn't have their interests at heart?
Well, I think there are two ways of looking at it. I mean, I think that Africa or South Africa has a very important role to play, representing not only itself, but in fact the African continent. Do I think that there should be another African country there? Yes, I do. When we originally formed the G20, we wanted Nigeria to be there. I think it should have been, but at that time it was going through a lot of upheaval, and it didn't happen. But I think that a number of these countries have to represent more than simply themselves, and South Africa is clearly one. Do I believe that the G20 has to take Africa's concerns into account? Unequivocally.
How come?
Because Africa has got a population of just under 1 billion, and in the lifetime of our children, it's going to be the largest, 2 billion, the largest agglomeration of people in the world. And there's a real chance that the Africa of that time, in the year 2050, could provide the economy with the same shot of adrenaline that China is now providing us. And if it doesn't, if African young people, the youngest population in the world at that time, if those people are poor and desperate, then I think we are really going to be buying an enormous amount of trouble. And it won't be Africa's fault. It will be our fault because we didn't give Africa really the help that it needed at this time to build its economy so that when it weighs the largest population in the world, in fact, it can do what China and what we hope India will do.
Would it be useful to African interests to create a United States of Africa?
Oh, I believe very strongly. I'm now working on that.
One whole country?
No, not one whole country, but one whole market. They should
see.
absolutely form a common market. It's 53 countries, small, shallow markets that cannot compete. If you bring that together and you put the infrastructure in there, I really believe that the Africans can do what the Chinese and the Indians have done. Absolutely.
What about Muammar Gaddafi's idea, though, of one country on the whole continent?
Well, I think that's a political decision which we should lead to the Africans. But I don't believe they have to be one country in order to have one market. And I think that they should do that, absolutely. And by the way, that's part of the African Union Charter.
What did, talking a bit at that CG conference about whether or not it would be possible to host a G20 meeting on the African continent in one of the countries there as a means of demonstrating that the G20 are interested and are serious. Could you do that?
Oh, sure you could. But yes, you could, and I think ultimately we're going to have to do it. When we formed the G20, the finance ministers, one of the things that was a Canadian idea that we put in there was that you'd have the meeting at a G8 country and then at another G20 country, and that you would have to alternate. So definitely it should be held in South Africa. Let me just say one other thing. This is your second time you refer to the CG meeting. That CG meeting was tremendously important. It shows really the Canadian ownership over the G20. If it hadn't been for organizations like CG, who really are providing the intellectual firepower for the G20, I don't think we would have made the strides that we did in terms of the G20.
This is just for those who don't know, the Center for International Governance and Innovation in Waterloo. I did ask some of the people at that conference, could you host one of these things in Africa? And to a person, they all said, nope, you couldn't guarantee the security of any of the players there. And that's why it'll never happen.
Well, they had the World Cup of Soccer was held in South Africa. You know, I think that absolutely you could. I just think, to be quite honest, I think that's a little bit of Western arrogance. I think, yes, you could.
One last thing here in our last minute. And again, this was something that a lot of people told me at the conference. You're going to forgive this personal observation. You're 71 years old now. You look a hell of a lot better now than you did when you were in public life. And I bet people say that to you all the time. Is there something about being out and doing your own thing now? You've got your foundation taking care of Africa, you've got your foundation on Aboriginal issues, you care very much about this G20 thing, you haven't got people hounding you day and night from media and opposition. Is life a little better for you right now?
Well, you know, when I stepped down, Frank McKenna once said to me, I'll tell you, he's told me the difference. He said, you're going to wake up in the morning, you're going to pick up the paper, and you're not going to shudder. And you know, I think he was right.
But it's kind of a serious question away. You look better. Do you get rejuvenated when you leave public life?
Oh, I think it's what you do. I mean, as you can see, whether it's Africa, whether it's the whole Aboriginal file in Canada, or the G20, you get totally involved, and there's a lot of things that you're not worried about, like getting elected and that kind of thing. But I think it totally depends on what you do when you step down, and whether you're able to simply say, okay, that's one stage of my life, it's over, let's get on with it. And I think that makes life pretty good.
It's awfully good of you to spend some time with us here at TVO tonight, Mr. Martin. Thanks so much.
Great to be here.